Hello and welcome everyone to Last Level Press. I'm Mr. Black and this is the Blacklist E3 2014 edition. I know, I recognize I am extremely late in addressing this year's E3. I have no excuse, only an apology, so let's skip straight into what exactly I'm doing. The Blacklist is not an all-encompassing journalistic series. It is an editorial piece. It is my personal highlight reel of any given event. The Blacklist actually started as a print series editorial on Last Level Press proper, and I've decided to adopt it to the video format given that I've got a larger audience this way. Now, as you can already see in the background, I will unfortunately not be able to reasonably give you guys background footage relevant to the games that I'll be discussing throughout this video. Reason being, as many of you are probably already aware, E3 tends to be a rather dodgy time for anyone on YouTube in terms of addressing it. Simply mentioning E3 can sometimes bring down the ire of a myriad of publishers, much less actually featuring any of their E3 footage. So as much as I would love to actually give you guys the game trailers, the release, the demo footage that we were shown at E3 every time I mention a game, I just can't reasonably do that without risking errant copyright strikes and things of that nature. So I would definitely encourage you all, if you have not already, if you've been living under a rock and haven't followed E3, to go and check out the gameplay demos and trailers of the games I'll be discussing. Now, as I mentioned, this being an editorial piece and not a comprehensive piece, there are simply some games that I won't really be covering here for a multitude of reasons. Some, like Dragon Age Inquisition, I simply don't know enough about. I'm not really all that familiar with the Dragon Age series, having only played about a third of the first game, so I can't really faithfully comment on them. Others, like Bloodborne and Magicka 2, we were only really shown pre-rendered hype trailers for, so there's no gameplay to comment on, and seeing as I don't really find that to be terribly relevant, and I don't like to just throw tinder on the hype fire for any game, even if I am personally excited about it, I'll be avoiding those for the purposes of this video at least. Now, all that said, on to the games. First, for this evening, Mass Effect 4. Bearing in mind that all of the footage we were shown of this game at this year's E3 is conceptual and therefore greatly subject to change if previous years' concept footage and even concept art is anything to go by, which it very much is, this game looks to have the promise to be stunning. Extremely high-res renders were displayed throughout the concept footage that we were shown, and claims from Bioware indicate that they will be taking this game up a notch. They will be moving not only to a new region of space, but also to a new sense of scale. It seems as though they're wanting to push the boundaries of Mass Effect once again. And one of the chief ways that they look to be doing that is re-tapping something that they did in the first Mass Effect game, which wasn't terribly well received simply because even though conceptually it worked well, in execution it didn't. That is the planetary exploration mechanic. That, once again, it was just rather barren and underwhelming the first time around, even though it had the potential to really tap that sensation of awe and wonder when it comes to space exploration. Well, given that the Bioware team seems to want to move this forward and to cover new regions of space, new characters, new romantic interests they were keen to specify, I'm hoping that this means, never mind my concerns regarding narrative cohesion, that this game will do something different, that it will actually tap some of that wonder that the first game, and not really the second or third, started to really capture and then left off on. As far as details go, we don't really know a great deal about Mass Effect 4 just yet. We don't even know when it's set, much less where. They have been so vague in mentioning that, yes, this isn't a new region of space, it could very well be in a whole separate galaxy for all we know. I mean, during the events of Mass Effect 2 and 3, we get to visit most of the galaxy, even if it's only briefly and only in specific little places. So unless they're going, and I'm going to show my Mass Effect nerd colors here, unless they're going deep beyond the Veil or into the Attican Traverse, there's very few places that we haven't really been seen, explored, been there, done that, blown it up before in terms of Mass Effect. So I, for one, kind of hope that we do see an entirely new region of space perhaps, at the other end of some newly discovered relay, but that is purely speculation on my part. As far as concrete details go, the keen-eyed amongst you may have noticed, as I did during some of the conceptual footage, that there was a Krogan shown, roaring as always, gotta be going with the blood rage there, as well as on the armor of one of the more prominent humans on display who was wearing a mask, so we know nothing about them, regardless of whether or not they'll even be the main character. I rather suspect they will be, but on said armor was an N7 logo, which leads me to believe that very likely the main character of the next game, like Shepard, will be an N7 Marine. And as a little addendum here, this doesn't really merit its own entry on the list per se, but Bioware did reveal during the sort of behind-the-scenes footage that they made for this year's E3. It wasn't really an interview so much as it was a sort of like a little DVD special that they released, that they are working on another IP, which we've really not got any details on. We don't even have a working title for yet, but that they described as, again, being very story and narrative-driven, as well as choice-driven, and that it will be a much more contemporary title. So what that means, I don't know, but given that with a few hiccups that I will never forget, but that I can forgive, BioWare's got a really well-orchestrated and impressive past, so I'm looking forward to seeing what they can do with a contemporary title. Now, next up, Far Cry 4. And this one, we've actually got a release date for. It'll be released November 18th, 2014, not terribly long from now. So, as such, after the release of the first 5-minute or so early few minutes of the game trailer that was released at the beginning of E3 this year, we were also shown a great deal of gameplay for Far Cry 4, and that much I'm quite willing to sink my teeth into. But before I do that, I want to note that I'm rather excited for this game's villain. I was really concerned that Far Cry 4 would not be able to top what came before by way of Vas Montenegro of Far Cry 3, one of the best villains in gaming of the last decade. But from what we've seen of Pagan Min thus far, I think they just might be able to pull it off. I don't know if they'll top Voss, but they may very well have crafted a villain on his level. As another journalist rather colorfully coined it, this villain looks to be outstandingly hateable, and I like that about him. Now, as far as the overall game premise goes, this is another open-world title set in the fictional country of Kyrat in the Himalayan mountains, based rather heavily upon Tibet, Nepal, and other surrounding countries. And the main character, AJ Gale, is returning to his homeland, so we'll not be playing a white boy this time. We're actually going to be playing an Asian guy, and I'm glad to see that, to scatter his mother's ashes, and then immediately gets caught up in the usual Far Cry brand of Civil War madness. As for the gameplay itself, from what we've seen of the footage released thus far, the game looks impressive, but it doesn't necessarily look like it's pushing many visual boundaries. Now, I'm going to take a devil's advocate stance here and say that next-gen titles don't necessarily, mind you, need to look much better than what's come before. Next gen can mean different things to different people, and one of the things that I'm hoping that they'll be tapping here is that while it can maintain the same sort of visual quality of what's come before, they can also render a great deal more processes in the background of the game, be it people going about daily schedules, be it different forms of AI running in the background, the likes of which games like Watch Dogs have tried to do by giving so many different dozens, hundreds, thousands of people unique schedules and things that they'll be doing in backgrounds, things like that. And it does look like Far Cry 4 is going to be doing a little bit of that by way of native animal AI and active predation and other sort of interactions. Now, how much of that there's going to be, how deep that system is going to be, I don't know. We've not been shown enough to really be able to comment upon that. But if nothing else, it does look like an improvement over Far Cry 3. So there's that. Feature-wise, there aren't a great deal of new things on the table here, but the Far Cry formula already works rather well. So there are a few returning glorious features, the likes of takedowns and the wingsuit, which, despite my vertigo, I'm glad to see returning. and a new form of environmental exploration, grappling hooks and other sorts of items that they said that there would be more of. And I dearly hope, that the grappling mechanic will allow for much more fluid exploration of the game's much more vertical environments, given that this is going to be set in the mountains. I dearly hope that this does not go the way of the grapple mechanics from Killzone Shadowfall, which were incredibly contextual and inconsistent and really didn't do the game any favors whatsoever. Given that this is a completely different developer, I know it's apples and oranges to compare them, but I've still got that bad taste in my mouth from Shadowfall, so I'm just hoping that this is not that. Now, I mentioned that takedowns are once again returning. Of course, it's Far Cry, they would have to be, but there are new takedowns available now. Some really caught my eye from the gameplay footage that we were shown, including vehicular takedowns. Yes, really. As in, pulling someone out of a vehicle to steal it, a little bit a la Grand Theft Auto in that sort of regard, only first person, but also vehicle-to-vehicle takedowns. Jumping out of one's own door into the cab of another moving vehicle, popping the driver and throwing him out. It is gloriously gory and violent, and I love it, and it definitely looks like it's going to allow for much more fluid gameplay as far as vehicular combat goes, so I like it. I also like the fact that it does look like, finally, my wish from Far Cry 3 has been granted for 4. We may use weapons from within vehicles. Finally. Lastly, co-op is purported to be a very strong feature for Far Cry 4, and they're approaching it in a somewhat different manner, it looks like, than they did for Far Cry 3, which actually sported its own separate co-op campaign, and it was rather universally regarded as a tacked-on feature that no one was terribly fond of. This time it looks like they're doing more of a sort of seamless drop-in, drop-out sort of mechanic, where other players can join the game, and once you open up to other players to join your game, you then, essentially while they're connected, disable the single-player campaign mode and leave the game opened up for free roam and camp and stronghold raids. So how much worth that will really add to the game, I don't know. I hope there's a little bit more to it than what we've been shown thus far, even though it was really fun to watch the main character and Herc fly around on their adorable little helicopter machine and bomb the hell out of a stronghold. I just don't necessarily see that as adding a great deal of unique content and entertainment to the game insofar as any other co-op game has done in the past. Now that said, there is something new at work with the multiplayer Far Cry 4 that I've never heard of any game doing before. Now, Sony's CEO has claimed that the friends you invite into your game, at least via the PlayStation 4, I'm not sure if he confirmed this for PC, if you know, do please inform me in the comments below, they don't necessarily need to have bought the game to join yours. They need only have a connection, and I assume then the relevant background files a la Gmod will then be streamed to their device. So once again, the mechanics of how that's going to work are completely lost on me. I don't know. I don't even know whether or not they've been enumerated yet. But that's rather cool. Now then, on to the next game, another one from Ubisoft, The Division, one that I've had my eye on for quite a while now, and which does look to be very impressive, even though they've been rather tight-lipped regarding it ever since it was announced. Powered by Ubisoft's Snowdrop engine, the game looks fantastic, especially given how many dynamic environmental effects, footprints, particle effects, snowflakes are all on screen, rendered at one time, interacting dynamically with what's going on in the environment at one time. It's mind-bogglingly impressive. However, an obviously scripted demo kind of took away from the gameplay on display at E3 this year, after the usual pre-rendered hype trailer that, while impressive, didn't tell us anything about the game. And I want to note something here, or rather pose a question here, before really moving on to the analysis of the gameplay that we were shown. Why must the developers of games like this, it's usually squad-based shooting experience developers, always when they release their co-op demos, lead us into trying to believe that it's not the devs that we're seeing, and that these players are acting surprised by things when clearly they would already know what's going on, and it comes off as false, it comes off as forced, And it seems like a waste when these people could otherwise, rather than faking things we don't care about, be giving us meaningful commentary regarding the gameplay and what to expect from it. Now that I've gotten that off my chest, let's move on a little bit. The gameplay that we were shown this year doesn't really display a great deal more than what we were shown last year. However, there are a few new features that are worth mentioning. Chief of those is really more or less the setting itself. The Division's vision of a ruined pseudo-post-apocalyptic New York is absolutely stunning. And the sense of scale that it looks like the map of this game is indicating is definitely rather ambitious. I question how much of the game will be a la Fallout, just unexplorable buildings. However, there were quite a few actually open and interactable environments, at least within the, once again, scripted demo that we were shown. So how much of that path was rendered open because that's what they wanted to do for the demo, I don't know. Consider me a bit of a skeptical cynic when it comes to these sorts of expectations. I've been burned by too many E3 demos before to give them much of a benefit of the doubt here. As far as more concrete features, which we can feast our eyes upon and judge for ourselves based upon what is in front of us, character animations do look very smooth and very solid, and that's something that I'm rather a stickler for in just about any game, but that usually, at least, Ubisoft tends to deliver rather well for. There also seems to be a fair amount of variety in terms of gadgetry that players can utilize for tactical interactions on the fly, like little drones and things of that nature, active scans, and I'm hoping that those are more of a focal point of the action and less the tacked-on gimmick that so many other games have made analogous features into. The most impressive of the new features confirmed this year are players' ability to not only fight for control over, but to then upgrade bases throughout the city. And I, for one, am rather interested in that. Now, I do question how deep this system will go, and given that the game is an MMO of sorts, whether or not, if players are offline, whether other players will then be able to take controlled strongholds from them during the interim. I don't know. These are details that I'm either not aware of or that simply haven't been announced yet, so we'll have to see on that. Next up, Assassin's Creed Unity. Yes, another Ubisoft game. No, I was not paid off by them. I just like what they produce. At first, when I saw the gameplay demo of Unity, I wasn't terribly impressed by the visual quality. It looked a lot like what's come directly before it. And then we got to The Crowd. If you have not watched their E3 trailer, I urge you go do so right now and look at the rendering ability of this game. Hundreds, if not over 1,000 animated NPCs on screen at one time. Now there's actually a reason to use assassin vision and to actually believably get lost in a crowd, much less choose targets out of a crowd, because there are so many people in the game world. This is what next gen looks like, people. Finally, someone is actually tapping the power of next gen hardware. Why is it taking this long? This is what I was talking about before. What I meant by the fact that the game doesn't necessarily have to look overly amazing as compared to what's come before, but that it can do so much more in the background. This is a sort of marriage of those two ideas. The amount of processing power that it must take to power that many independent NPC AIs at one time, staggering. So while they may not necessarily be so much more HD than what's come before, there are simply so many more of them that to discount that sort of graphical progress is foolish and ignorant. My God, this is just absolutely impressive. But all is not sunshine and rainbows when it comes to this game. The biggest thing that stood out negatively for me when it comes to Unity is its animations. They look dated, they look jerky, they look sudden and still very decidedly last gen in quality. Something that I was dearly hoping we would see a sort of across the bar improvement on from everyone, but that no one has really done. Fortunately, though, the fencing animations, while jerky and while a little bit abrupt, do actually impress me a little bit. Seeing as this game is set in France just before the French Revolution, the game's swordplay looks like French fencing. It looks accurate. I've never studied fencing myself, but it looks believable to me from what little I've studied of medieval fencing. And yes, you heard me right. The setting of Assassin's Creed Unity is France on the eve of the French Revolution. The year is 1789 in Paris, and it looks excruciatingly detailed, so I'm not really all that averse to the fact that, unlike a few of the previous games which took place in multiple settlements, it seems as though Unity will be taking place solely within the confines of Paris itself. Paris is huge in this game, so I'm not really all that concerned about it being a very confined game world, especially since it looks like there are a great deal more enterable and explorable interior spaces. Buildings are not just these big boxy facades taking up space in the world, they're actually things that you can enter. And that really goes a long way in giving a city life, in giving it a real sense of depth. And on a small note, the game's background music actually struck me as rather impressive after I was rather unimpressed by what I heard of the background tracks from previous Assassin's Creed games after the first. I'm one of those that usually just tends to like the first game in a series, but the background tracks here really caught my attention. They weren't those that I just kind of hear and then tune out. They stuck with me, so I'm impressed to see what this composer is doing now. Lastly, co-op is making a return for Assassin's Creed Unity, up to 4-player co-op. And while each of Unity's multiplayer avatars may look rather similar, something which got Ubisoft in no small amount of hot water once that revelation came to light, they won't necessarily play all alike, seeing as now we've got the introduction of skill trees to allow players to differentiate their characters in terms of abilities and specialties. I know during some of the gameplay demos, questions of lockpicking came up, as well as increased stealth abilities, so I don't know exactly how in-depth these skill trees are going to get, or really how much they'll affect gameplay, but I'm excited to see that there's at least some degree of personalization other than cosmetic in this game. And if you are hoping for a scathing rake over the coals for Ubisoft on my part, regarding the fact that all 4 of the multiplayer avatars are all male, and actually all look really similar, that's what actually struck me, even when I first saw it, before the whole gender politics scandal really came out of this, I just thought it looked rather uninspired. They all looked very, very similar. I will say that while it doesn't necessarily offend me on a great and deep level that all of the avatars are male, I, however, did find Ubisoft's reasoning and excuses provided once they were called on that to be absolute asinine falsehoods. The idea that implementing female characters when they've done it before would just be too much work. No, I'm sorry. You don't get to show off the fact that you've rendered several hundred independently animated and AI programmed NPCs on screen at one time, and then say that it's too much work to do a model swap for a playable character. Now, getting away from Ubisoft, let's let us simmer down, calm. Back to EA, another really just beloved publisher by the entire gaming community. This time we are talking about Mirror's Edge 2, developed this time by DICE and powered by the Frostbite engine. The new conceptual footage confirms my suspicions from last year that what we were shown last year was nothing more than a pre-rendered facade, like I called it out to be. This year, however, we were actually shown some real conceptual in-game testing footage. Obviously nothing at all representative of the way that the final game will look or play, but we were at least now shown working models and animations and such. And on the topic of animations, they still look rather abrupt. They look good. It looks like they're going for a more quick, fast-paced combat system, but I'm hoping, at least, that because this is still in such early development, that the abrupt animations we were shown will get smoothed out later on. As for what we can expect from this game, I've not got a great deal to say, seeing as we weren't actually shown all that much, but as a huge fan of the original Mirror's Edge, who was just incredibly let down by the fact that there was so much potential in that game, I could see the silhouette of the amazing game it could have been instead of the niche, passably okay, mediocre, sometimes good game that the original was. I'm really hoping that we can actually get some more of that momentum-based gameplay back for the next one, and that they really polish and perfect that formula. The demo did indicate a little bit of that, at least in terms of the fact that they are looking at implementing multiple paths through any given environment, more or less aimed at being a sort of in-level difficulty slider. There are going to be some paths through an environment that will come very intuitively to very skilled players, but that will take a great deal of skill to actually execute, and others that may go a bit slower, but that will still be approachable and viable for new or inexperienced players. So while I wish I could tell you guys more about Mirror's Edge 2, that's really all we were shown and all I can comment on, but it has to merit an entry on this list. Once again, this is not necessarily journalistic content, this is editorial, so I love my Mirror's Edge, had to mention it. And while we're on the subject of DICE, Star Wars Battlefront. I am rather in awe at the conceptual footage that we were shown for this game in development. Once again, as always, conceptual footage, take it with a shot of salt. But the team at DICE Stockholm actually went out of their way, from what we were shown, to go and visit the LucasArts archives and to get their hands upon some of the original props, upon some of the original set pieces used in the films, to really capture the spirit of those films, much less the actual details. And in that same vein, they went and visited a number of the original filming locations, like the desert, like the Redwood Forest, to once again capture the sensation of those settings from the real world, much less the fictional vision that the Star Wars community has crafted these from. And what's more, they do claim to be working very closely with Lucasfilm, so I hope that that means that this game will be a much more faithful Star Wars title than many that have come rather recently under that license. But just as with Mirror's Edge 2, this is a short entry, given that we weren't really shown much about this game this year. So, on to the next one. And the next one is Battlefield Hardline. Now, a number of you are already rather familiar with my thoughts regarding this game, having already released my open beta review of this game. So this is a bit of a recap. Battlefield Hardline was at first leaked and then confirmed at E3 this year, and on the very confirmation day revealed to, on that day, be getting a release into closed beta. And I can now speak from personal experience that the game looks like and is Cops and Robbers Battlefield as though it were Payday 2 with PvP. As my hook line for the beta review went, to call Battlefield Hardline a reskinned Battlefield 4 is to give Hardline too much credit. The visuals look to be on par, and in some cases below par, with Battlefield 4, which is to say, impressive but not at all boundary pushing, and rather unsettlingly familiar in terms of the team's ambition. And just as with The Division, once again, the 6-minute multiplayer gameplay demo released at this year's E3 was painfully obviously scripted. Too much hipfire, too many inaccurate enemies, too many contextual lines of commentary from the main character, not to mention the cinematic timing of everything. And did I catch a "don't tase me bro" in there at 4:30? I think I did. Yeah, I caught that. That was the one nice thing from that video, DICE. Or rather, not DICE, Visceral Games. This time, Battlefield has left DICE's possession and gone into the hands of another developer. And as once again I mentioned in my open beta, or rather my closed beta review of Hardline, were I EA, I would be rather angrily disappointed in Visceral for what they've done to this concept. As I'm sure you can tell by my demeanor regarding this game, I find it really, truly very hard to get interested in Battlefield Hardline, and largely for personal reasons. As I've mentioned before, I was raised around and for a time worked around law enforcement, and I find this game's depiction of said subject to be utterly inaccurate. And I recognize that the Battlefield series has never been about realism, it has never been about accuracy, but if one is attempting to distance oneself by way of an entirely new theme from the usual tired modern military shooter, the likes of previous Battlefield titles, there was a way to do that this game simply isn't doing. This is only moving away from military gameplay with rocket launchers and minigun-mounted vehicles in a nominal sense, because all of the old Battlefield analogs are present, and they haven't even been reskinned in a believable sense for law enforcement versus criminal, i.e. Cops and Robbers Battlefield, and it just comes off as underwhelmingly inambitious, and I, for one, am completely unimpressed. And lastly, for this year's Blacklist, there is Destiny. Now, I don't have a lot to say here, considering that this year's E3 trailer for the game was largely a recap of things that we already knew. However, throughout that trailer were a sprinkling of new gameplay clips, which did demonstrate a little bit more of the variety in terms of environments, as well as aliens and armor, and even player class abilities by the looks of it. However, that gameplay footage, interspliced as it was with obviously pre-rendered footage, didn't really look particularly high res, so I'm hoping that Destiny will, as I mentioned before, channel a bit more the spirit of background next-gen functionality rather than visual, because as yet, the visuals don't really compel me. In terms of fidelity, mind you, the art style I very much like the look of, but its amounts of impressive lighting, of details, of high-res textures, not really doing it for me just yet. And neither is the dialogue from the Portal 2-esque Space Corps narrator. He gave a bit more background for the game, yes, but he wasn't particularly thrilling in his near-on relaxed, very contemporary-sounding voice acting. And while I know others will disagree with me here, as I've already seen a number of articles praising Destiny's soundtrack, to me at least, Martin O'Donnell's forced departure from Bungie is all the more apparent in the game's E3 trailer at least, seeing as I was not privy to the closed beta testing period available to, I believe, console gamers for this game. So once again, I cannot claim at all to have first-hand experience with the game, but I was completely underwhelmed by the soundtrack at work in the E3 trailer at least. So we'll have to wait and see on this one. I've said before that there's a lot of potential for Destiny, but with this game shaping up to absolutely eclipse the development costs of all other games before it, racking up over $250 million in development costs, even if this game is rather successful when it comes to full release, I question whether the returns will come anywhere near to justifying the development costs of this game on Bungie's end. And it's not lost on me that it's not at all unlikely that if this game does poorly, even though some of the early gameplay accounts of it are largely positive, this could end Bungie, given the fact that this game has racked up so high a cost. If it doesn't perform to a 10, this could very well have been the shooting too high. This could be their Icarus. And I, for one, do not hope to see that, mind you. But it just seems like they're rolling a great deal of dice here. They may very well, if they're incurring these kinds of costs, be pioneering new technologies, new rendering methods, all kinds of new things that are beyond my small-brained understanding of game development. And unfortunately, if that's the case, and then this game doesn't live up to the sorts of returns that it's going to need to have been worth it, we could very well see another game that could channel the same sort of functionality, of spirit, of scope even, of Destiny a few years from now that might take a quarter the cost simply because the guys working on Destiny may have had to have then pioneered rather expensively all the new technologies that companies coming after them will then take advantage of. Pure speculation on my part, but if they're racking up those kinds of costs, something has to be causing it. And as a last note, I find myself echoing the lamentations of a certain Kotaku writer the more I see of this game. That is to say, it's less the Wild West in space that some of the early promo art and material would have led us to believe, and a little bit more overtly sci-fi. So, while that is purely a matter of personal taste, it just seems appropriate to pull a page from Cowboy Bebop and say, "See ya, Space Cowboy." And on that note, that wraps the Blacklist E3 2014 edition. Thank you all for joining me. Once again, this is not at all meant to be a comprehensive coverage piece for E3 2014. It is merely my personal highlights. There were many more games covered this year than I've even got the time or inclination to get around to, most notably, as King Atticus is very excited about, a lot of other very interesting titles coming from Nintendo. But seeing as I'm going to keep to my word, and until Nintendo eases back on their antiquated policies regarding online independent press coverage, I will not be featuring any of their works, or mentioning any of them by name even. Even though some of them do excite me a great deal. I've got to hold to my guns here and simply ignore them on a professional sense. That's what Atticus is for. He's more forgiving of them than I am. This is how we are able to cover all of our bases. So, thank you all for joining me for the Blacklist E3 2014 edition here at Last Level Press. I am Mr. Black, and as always, I wish you all good gaming and Godspeed.